Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Gabriel, your AP Environmental Science teacher. We are taking the course also known as APES, and you are going to be taking your very first quiz in just a very few days. This video is an introduction to Chapter 1, Modules 1.1 and 1.2, which we have also gone over in class. The video's purpose is really just to remind you of the material that we reviewed in class and in your homework to help you better prepare for your very first quiz. Many of the slides will not be read to you, and they also will not be shown for very long. If you feel I'm going too fast in the video, then just pause and read and study on your own. Just to remind you, I gave you reading guide questions for doing your homework. You do have homework where, well, it's up on the board. What I have in yellow here are for each module. So these are guiding questions and suggestions on things that you should kind of take away from the reading while you're taking notes at home. And this is also something you should revisit if you look at what it's in red. You should revisit the questions and the review questions when you're studying for the last time before a test or quiz for me. Okay, just to remind you, we went over some very simple introductory vocabulary for the modules in this chapter. One is just the environment. So how do we define the environment? It's the sum of all conditions surrounding us that support life. And I introduced this to you with a conversation. We started with the wood frogs. And the reason why we did wood frogs is because frogs are amphibious. And their skin, the skin of amphibians, is incredibly sensitive to environmental pollutants and pathogens. So if a frog population changes, we pay attention because that means the environment has changed. Therefore, frogs are indicator species. We monitor frogs to indicate if the environment is changing. So I'm going to remind you that the video was on YouTube. It was about 3.5 minutes long, and it was on wood frogs. I'm not going to show it in this video. You can look it up if you need to again. We related those pros and cons to the material in the textbook. So you can restudy this, although you should have added it to your notes from your homework. For example, one of the reasons we do fracking is because it's a cleaner fossil fuel and because the future energy needs of our country could depend on it. But some of the reasons that we don't like fracking is because by hydraulic fracturing, we can contaminate our groundwater and we can contaminate our air. You know the whole list. When we discuss our environment, we are referring to the conditions surrounding us that influence life. So the different terms that we are looking at is environment, we already defined that, environmental science, and ecosystems. They all begin with E. We are going to act as environmental scientists this year. An environmental scientist is like a research. They use science and they do not use bias in their reports or in their evaluation. Environmentalists, on the other hand, they are activists, lobbyists. They are very politically biased. So they might use a lot from environmental science, which is wonderful. They just can't get caught up in the bias. Environmental science is very interdisciplinary. We are going to be crossing over into many different realms in order for us to understand the big picture of the big ideas of the world that we live in. So we might bring in some laws. We're definitely going to bring in some laws. We're going to talk some chemistry. We're going to bring in toxicology, economics, politics, ethics, you name it. It's going to be part of the course. We did talk about how environmental scientists look at things in different scales, and when they're examining something at a small scale, that might be an example of a physiologist or a marine biologist. When we look at a larger scale, we can go from marine biologist to even larger, an oceanographer. Humans may pollute air or water, which affects these systems. Human impacts are increasing in magnitude due to an increase in human populations. Some of the examples we talked about are just how we manipulate the environment. We even took a walk about that. We use more tools, and the tools will help us better with extracting natural resources and working and living in our environment. And we have learned to fire, hunt, overfish. We've learned to change our ecosystems on purpose. And we call these things anthropogenic impacts. These are impacts made by humans. So we then looked at a video on invasive species, and I introduced you to some of the basic concepts of humans introducing invasive species into an environment, what an invasive species is, and then we looked at examples of invasive species that are specific to Maryland. We also looked at examples of invasive species so you could recognize some things that we actually don't like, such as the Callery pear, the ash borer, the stink bug, Canadian geese, rock snot, and then we took a walk and we tried to identify characteristics of our environment, identify anthropogenic impacts of the environment, and create a map and get to know our campus. We finished Module 1. We took a footprint quiz for you to get a better idea of the impacts of your lifestyle on our environment. Then we went into Module 1-2. In Module 1-2, we got introduced to ecosystem services. These are important. Ecosystems provide many important resources needed for us to live. For example, in this diagram, we were talking about the forest. So a forest provides food for us to eat, wood for us to use for building, provides aesthetic beauty. It's healthy, rich soils help grow trees and plants, and forests help with climate regulation. It's critical that forests are not removed, as these services that I just listed are vital to life on Earth. So we went over ecosystem services, and resources such as clean water, timber, fisheries, crops are all produced because of the ecosystem services provided by those bigger resources. Then we talked about the environmental indicators. Remember, an indicator is that describes the current state of an environmental system. We already talked about that with the frogs. You had a list of environmental indicators in your textbook in Table 2.1. We discussed what these are, what they mean, how we use them as indicators, how we measure them when we use them as indicators, because we have to measure them year to year to year to year in order for us to notice trends. We talked about your footprint, we talked about hectares, acres, the conversions. You need to know your conversion factors. You need to know that 1 hectare is actually almost 2.5 acres. You have to know that a kilometer is 1,000 meters, and 1,000 kilometers is 1,000 times 1,000, so just remember that. And 1 square kilometer is equal to 1 million meters. If you don't remember how we did that, just practice it on your own. So then you take that table that had all these different examples of indicators, but really the big takeaway is that there's 5 big key indicators, 5 key global indicators that we look at because global impacts are what matters the most right now. And as you can see, we measure biodiversity all the time globally. We have seen a trend. The extinction rate is increasing. Data shows us that the human impacts causing this are not changing, so we can expect that the extinction rate is going to continue to increase because the humans aren't changing what we're doing that have already affected that. You're going to learn this all year. We're going to talk about human impacts on the environment and these big 5 key global indicators. So then we went into other slides. We spent a little more time on each key global indicator. The first indicator was biological diversity. I explained to you that biodiversity is the diversity of all life. If a population of organisms such as birds and a human disturbance wreaks havoc on the ecosystem, the birds with the greatest ability to respond to change and to survive are going to be the ones that have the highest genetic diversity. They're going to be the most different from one another. Genetic diversity is the smallest scale we look at, but it's an important scale. The next scale up is species diversity. The number of species on Earth that have been discovered and identified is about 2 million. So there's different species of frogs, there's different species of birds, but we think all together with all species of all things that we've actually discovered and identified that we know there's 2 million, which means since we keep discovering new ones every year, there's many more than 2 million. And remember, the more diversity we have, the better. The more we have at each level, the better. The more variety in ecosystems and in species and in genes, the better. Ecosystem diversity is the number of habitats in a given region. This is measured in land area. such as hectares. If ecosystem diversity decreases, so does species and genetic diversity. Species are a group of organisms distinct from other groups in like morphology, like their body form and their structure, behavior, or biochemical properties. Species diversity is the number of species in a region or in a particular type of habitat, of species in a region or habitat. That's it. And there they are. I just went over it. So species do evolve. Speciation is the evolution of new species. This happens very slowly over time. There's about 1 to 3 new species per year worldwide that come from other species. You'll learn about that a lot in biology. And then we have natural extinction. So we get background extinction rates of about 2 species a year. That's the average. That happens very slowly over time. That's the average rate at which species become extinct. But humans are creating a lot of stress on the environment, mostly from habitat destruction and degrading habitats, like building on it differently. And more than 1,000 species are now going extinct per year. It's not that background rate where it should just be 2 species per year. It's 1,000 species per year. Here are some examples of endangered species, many of which have become endangered because of biological stress from humans on their environment. But the good news is human intervention is now trying to bring their environments back to them and put them into rehabilitation centers with other species of their kind to help save them from extinction. And we want to save them from extinction because we know that they're part of the big picture of biodiversity. Global indicator number 2 was food production, and that's our ability to grow food to nourish the entire human population. We use science and technology to increase the amount of food. Also remember that when we talk about these graphs, often they're reported in per capita, which just means per person. Which leads me to key environmental indicator number 3. This is the global world indicator, which is surface temperature and CO2 concentration changes. And when we look at CO2 concentrations, that is as a greenhouse gas. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and I'll show you a picture to remind you of that in a second. The most significant greenhouse gas is CO2, but there are other greenhouse gases. And the reason we are so concerned about it is because even though there's always naturally some CO2 in the atmosphere, there is an increase in concentration derived from human activities. This is the example that we looked at. So if you look at the light blue line, that is the heat trapping greenhouse gas line. So when heat, solar energy, hits the earth, then it gets trapped in there as heat and does not reflect out because CO2 and other greenhouse gases are trapping it in there, which then increases the global temperature. CO2 has always been present in the past 2 centuries, but in the past 2 centuries, the concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have risen. So it was present even before then. And it comes from volcanic emissions. We'll talk about all that in future chapters. But if you look at carbon dioxide in parts per million and follow the blue line shows the increase, which aligns with the Industrial Revolution and more emissions of CO2 from like burning fossil fuels like factories. We have also increased the rate of deforestation. Forests are getting cut down. Forests are great carbon sinks. So you put CO2 in the air and forests take the CO2 out of the air because they absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So less forests means we have less absorption. This is caused by humans, which is also referred to as an anthropogenic cause. So CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is increasing because of fossil use and deforestation. The orange line shows the upward trend in global temperature averages, which isn't surprising since we understand how the atmosphere traps heat and that the more CO2, the more heat trapping going on. Global indicator number 4 is about human population. Every new person born requires more water, more food, more land, and all from Earth. More and more people are born every year. We average about 1 million new people on Earth every 5 days. Can Earth sustain a few billion more people? Millions are already dying of starvation every day. By the way, this is updated. Your textbook is around 7.2 billion people on the planet. As of September 1st, 2018, we have about 7.6 billion people on the planet. Natural resources provide the energy and materials that support human civilization. As the human population increases, Earth's resources are being depleted. And when we talk about resources, we're talking about non-renewables, which are like coal, oil, uranium. These are things that can't be renewed or reused. Other natural resources are aluminum and copper, but we can recycle them. We can't recycle coal and oil. Some things are renewable. You're going to learn all about these more later in the year. Timber is an example of a renewable resource because we can plant a seed after we cut down a tree. So that was indicator number 5, resources and resource depletion. And the bigger takeaway about resource depletion is the patterns that we see when we compare developed to developing nations. So patterns of resource depletion vary among these types of nations. We, the US, are a highly developed country. There's a very sad pattern worldwide, as shown in this figure. Economic development goes hand in hand with overuse and abuse and consumption of resources. So the less economically developed countries use less resources. We are more economically developed. China and India are less economically developed. So most poor countries are typically still developing. So know the rule, 20% of the world population is developed, but we use most of the resources. For example, the developed world uses 58% of the world's energy. So we know what the big 5 global indicators are, and we know what we have done to affect those indicators and change them. So what we need to do next is practice more sustainable living. Sustainability means living in a way that allows humans to use resources without depriving future generations. That means your grandbabies and your great-grandbabies. You should not be using up their resources. So how do we do that? We start living more sustainably. We develop in a way that's economically okay and that manages our resources for us and our well-being as well as future well-being. The story of Easter Island is an example of a society that did not live sustainably. They used up resources and their environment collapsed, or so the story goes. Whether it's true or not, because they're beginning to think it's not, the idea and the concept is why you need to take care of your resources. So live with biophilia, love life, live with sustainable practices. You must not damage an area beyond the ability to recover, such as streams, such as your yard, such as building an apartment complex or a mall or a highway. You should consider the future generations on that land. You should not use up resources that are not renewable. And when you use resources, you should still think wisely about the impacts on the environment. Use everything sparingly. Be sparing. Minimalists. You calculated your ecological footprint. You should feel pretty bad about how much of an impact your non-sustainable lifestyle has on the planet. So use this to change your lifestyle and protect the future of the Earth. Things that we considered in your calculation are shown in this picture. And your lifestyle, how much food you eat, the type of food you eat, how much water you use in your home, and how much water is used in the products that you buy, these are all involved in your footprint. So let's get it down to one Earth. That is the end of modules 1 and 2 for chapter 1. We went over this in boot camp. This is your learning curve. I just want to remind you that when you learn the material in class, if you never review it again and you take the test 3 days later, you're only going to remember about 60% of the information. But if you learned it in class and follow me from the first learned, and then that night you study a little bit, it's like you learned it again the first time. And then if you review it again a night or 2 later, when you take the test, you should remember about 100% of the information. So review, review, and review again, and review again, and good luck on your quiz. This is Mrs. Gabriel signing off.